Greetings, YouTube. So far I've physically described the disk. It's considerably larger than the surface area of the Earth, so you've got lots of space to play with. Remember, it's a disk that rotates one day, one arc every day, so the sun comes up in a new spot every single day, so that the thing has 364 degrees to go all the way around for a 364 day calendar, 13 28-day months, 4 7-day weeks. And at the center is the structure known as the Great Compass, and that is inside the structure known as the Spire. The Spire will be a video of its own, at least one. I may be doing one just for the Spire itself, and then another for some of the political structures that take place in with the Spire, because the Spire itself is going to be the literal hub politically and with the power brokers of the entire disk itself. However, the disk is huge, and there's lots of things and lots of space to go on to get involved in. And there are peoples who are generations of peoples who have been raised and lived and died and never gotten anywhere near the center of the disk. So it's a big world, and there's lots of stuff to do with it. So as I've described, from the surface, you can go up 6 miles. After 6 miles, for every 100 yards you travel, your speed is reduced by 1 foot till eventually you grind to a halt, and then you are stuck like a fly in amber, where you starve to death or die of dehydration. And the same thing, you go down. Down is, you get to 6 miles, and again, you start tunneling further and further, and you go slower and slower and slower. No one's 100% sure how thick how it is, but since the wall is 10 miles high, they're assuming that the disk is at least 10 miles thick. Just you can't go down that far. Same thing with the ocean. There is at least a few spots that'll go down as deep as 6 miles. Then you begin to slow down. Now, Earth, the deepest point is 7 miles, so that's not a real stretch of the imagination as far as the depth of an ocean is concerned. And it's going to be a biosphere, biomes ranging from like Greek Cyprus zone up to the Scandinavian, just short of true Arctic Circle, maybe just pushing the Arctic Circle. And remember, since it's turning and the sun is in that track, you essentially have 2 summers, 2 springs, 2 falls, 2 winters every year. So it gets cool, warm, all the way down. So you get deep freezes, but they don't last long. It can be a very strange planting and animal life cycles at the edges. The peoples in the middle have a far more even temperature zone, and there would be bands of agriculture for the right kinds of plants. So you're going to be growing, olives and grapes and things like that, and then grains further out, and then so the plants would reflect that. The wild and natural plants would reflect that, as well as the agriculture. Not that there's going to be a field that goes all the way around the disk, mind you, but you get the idea. You'll have agricultural zones that would favor different kinds of agriculture over others. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about the peoples of the disk. Now, the races of men, the races that we most often think of as player character races, the elves, the dwarves, things like that, they surmise that the first peoples that were placed here 115,000 years ago, and they were the dragons. Now, they say surmise because the dragons aren't talking. Some dragons say they were here for far longer than that. Some say they don't remember. None of the dragons that were originally arrived here are still alive. It's been a long time. But it's been at least 115,000 years since the first dragon got here. Potentially longer if the mythology is true or not. You ask a dozen dragons, you're going to get 13 answers. So they were the first true sapient species that ended up here. 50,000 years after their arrival, the races of the giants showed up. And all the classic giants, the storm giants, cloud giants, probably, we don't need sea giants, do we? Because there are some just storm giants living in the ocean. I'm not positive. Titans, stone, fire, frost, hill, and then the two lesser giant races of ogres, very varying types of ogres, and trolls, varying types of trolls. And these races were the main political shakers of the disc for 100,000 years. 50,000 just dragons, and then the giants, and then the races they began to create. Because it was after the giants showed up that the dragons began to realize, well, we can start making these things. This humanoid frame is really useful to us. So that's when we started getting the kobolds. I've covered that in the video before. And then they began to also create anthropomorphic races. So you had a lot of uplifted races. So, dogmen and tigermen. It's where the hyena men, the gnolls came from, for example. So you began to have like the Thri-kreen came out of this, the Wemmick came out of this, all kinds of different animal type races. But again, it's a big disc. Lots of these groups are going to be very small populations. There aren't going to be huge quantities of them, but enough to be genetically stable. And it also there's a distinct possibility that some of the races that were created by both the dragons and by the giants have died out because they failed. But then 15,000 years ago, boom, the races of men show up. And that is also when the spire shows up. Prior to that, there was just the great compass at the center of the disc. And then the spire was placed on top of it. And the great compass is still a great tourist attraction, even though it's a bit like visiting the Grand Canyon. You go look at it, yep, that's a big hole. That's a big compass. It's a big compass. It's like 100 yards wide. It's a big compass. But it's people go there because they can then walk around the entire disc and say they've walked around the entire disc. It's a very touristy thing to do. But that's also where the cantrip that lets you know where the center is and how far away from it you are, and the location spell, I believe I said it was second level, that lets you pinpoint yourself within 100 yards anywhere on the entire disc, both altitude as well as so true three-dimensional placement of knowing exactly where you are. Useful for good enough to give you a pretty much safe passage for teleportation spells. And when the races of men showed up, that's when we had humans and dwarves and elves, and we had gnomes and halflings, or they called themselves the Varn, though people call them derogatorily the halflings. They called themselves the Varn. And that's singular and plural, Varn, V-A-R-N. And at a later date, we also ended up with goblins, which were genetically engineered out of Varn by some mad scientist, and it got out of his hands, out of control, and now they're all over the place. So races are still being developed in this world. And there are also aquatic races, as well as 4 elemental races. I can't remember all well, they called it a Ganesha or Ganeshi or something. I think they're from, the last time I read, they were from, I read about them was Pathfinder. I think they also existed in 3.5 D&D. But there's 4 elemental races, and as well as numerous aquatic races. So you can have as many or a few as you want. The Cerulean Seas setting is just chock full of useful information if you have any desire to ever populate your world under your underwater realm and have some solid rules for adventuring in that realm. So it's a big world with lots of peoples, and they're everywhere. Now, when the peoples showed up, at least the races of men, each group was deposited apparently at random around the world, around the disc. And each group that was left there by the gods, there was 1,000 people in that unit. And they were in the sex ratio appropriate for their particular species. So for humans and elves and gnomes and Varn, it was 50-50, male and female. For the dwarves, it was 4 males to 1 female. Why? Because that is the sex ratio of their species in my world. There are 4 males for every female born to the dwarven peoples. Women have massive political power, and the number of children, in particular the number of daughters you've had, places you in the political pecking order, the social pecking order. That makes it really easy to get into politics. If you are high in social power, switching in gears and sliding into politics is fairly simple. And if you have low numbers of births and you've never had any daughters, the chances of you getting any kind of political might in the dwarven peoples is pretty low. It's why when you see adventurers, they're almost always men, because they go out in the world to earn money for their families back home. And wives have more than one husband. Even the lowest status wife is going to have two. One is known as the hearth husband, and one is the one that goes out in the world and adventures. So that's the sex ratio for the dwarves. And it wasn't just one group. It wasn't like they dumped 1,000 humans and they called it good. There were multiple groups of humans and multiple groups of dwarves. You get the point. There were multiple groups, and they were scattered everywhere. And they all spoke their racial tongue. So humans have a human language. There is no common language in that sense. Eventually, they were able to discover that there was a language spoken at the Spire that none of the other races spoke. Nobody. Dragons didn't speak it. The giants didn't speak it. Nobody spoke this tongue. And that tongue, that language, became the lingua franca, at least for the areas fairly close to the Spire, to the hub itself. The further you get from the center, the less likely you are to encounter someone that speaks Spire. It's just the way it is. But that language allowed people to communicate more easily across their groups, because initially nobody spoke anybody's language. So strife was almost guaranteed. Now, most of the groups were eventually integrated to some larger social structures over time. But seeing how big this disk is, there were groups that were isolated for some hundreds, sometimes thousands of years before they came to realize that there were other groups on the disk. And I probably thought there'd be like one group that was the longest one. It was only a lost tribe that was only discovered, like 400 years ago or something. So for like 14,000 something years, they were isolated completely, thinking they were the only ones on this entire disk. Or maybe not even knowing they were on a disk for all they know. Just their world. So that's why there are no tropical forests. There still are rainforests, just like the Pacific Northwest types of rainforests. So it is quite possible to have very dense populations, very dense plants that may be a population hidden in there. They wouldn't necessarily be seen by a lot of people outside of that. So you have lots of people, and of course the GM who wants to use the disk, and again this is an idea for everybody to play with, can have as many or as few races as you want. You could have a hard number and say, this is how many races are, that's all I want there to be. You could say that it was only 1,000 or 10,000 of each one, and that they've been left to their own devices since then. And have any of them remained cohesive, or have all of them broken up into created new societies over the last 15,000 years? Because you're going to have varying groups with slightly different dialects of their racial tongue. And yeah, I would be throwing dialects in. It's just that I don't know if I'd penalize people for not necessarily taking points in that kind of thing, but I may do languages maybe a language group as opposed to a specific tongue. So when you say human, you may be talking about human dialects from this zone. So you speak all these different slight variations of human in that. And if you know Elven from this zone, so there's some cross, but there's also going to be groups that have separated over the last 15,000 years, and that's enough time for language speciation to have taken place. I mean, look, English is not that freaking old. English is not an old language. And lots of tongues have come and gone probably, and the number of speakers have disappeared. So again, you have a world where lots of peoples exist, and you can decide how successful they've been. Some probably died out completely because they were just put into areas that couldn't support their populations. Some maybe turned to different methods of survival. Maybe they went underground. Maybe they become ocean nomadics. Maybe they decided to just move into the Arctic zones or the zones that become Arctic twice a year. So the cultures that exist can be as varied as the GM wants them to be. it's a very dynamic world with the weather changing so much, and with there many, many different peoples. Now, again, I think there's a solid argument for limiting the number of races, otherwise it gets too populated. I also think it's really cool to have lots of different races, so it's really hard, like I'm like, yeah, I should narrow it down to a dozen. I played with that idea myself once, but I'm like, yeah, but then this race is cool, and that one over there, that's kind of neat, you know what I mean? And you never know which dozen you want to. Yeah, it's complex. So sometimes you just throw it up the window and say, play whatever you friggin' well want to. We'll figure out a justification for why your character exists in this area. That kind of thing. So that is roughly what you have for the peoples of the disc. And I still haven't come up with a name for the disc yet. I'm still working on that. So at the moment, it's just the disc world. Not Project Discworld, mind you, but my Discworld, which has yet to have a name. His Discworld, to the best of my knowledge, was just called Discworld. I've never read any Discworld series, so I couldn't tell you. So thank you for being here for this particular video, and I'm looking forward to anyone giving me input about the Discworld, any ideas that they might want to add to this, any thoughts they have on what would be the appropriate races, and what you think would be inappropriate for this particular setting. So let's talk about the races of my Discworld.